All right. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Wednesday, December 10th, and maybe we can start with Ukraine. So, what's going on over there?
What's going on? There's a war. There's a war going on over there in the eastern part of the country.
It's not
That's
going
the,
on it's not going very well for the Ukrainians, right? So,
yeah, that's fair to say. There's, um, yeah, and I think it's becoming increasingly clear, even to certain people in the West, and certainly quite a few people in Ukraine. I think, as I said last time, the narrative remains, that the Ukrainians are fighting bravely, holding on. It's basically, um, well, let's say a quagmire for the Russians. Close to a stalemate. Okay, it's admitted the Ukrainians are retreating a little bit, but very intelligently, and the Russians are suffering horrific losses. So that's the story, all in all. But you find more and more voices of dissent. They don't really go into appear in the mainstream narrative, but I think there's a growing awareness, and probably behind the scenes, people, leaders whispering to each other, saying, "Hey, this looks bad." Um, Recently, John Mearsheimer, the political scientist from the University of Chicago, spent some time in Europe and actually gave a speech at the European Parliament, and had an opportunity there to meet with and talk with many of the MEPs, the members of that parliament. And he said, he felt the majority of the ones, at least that he talked to, maybe this wasn't a representative sample because of who he is, understood what was going on. But there was still, he was actually amazed at the number of people who still believed that everything was just fine, and they just had to, support Ukraine a little bit longer and Ukraine would collapse. And so that is still very much there, and it seems to exist at the highest levels. I think, perhaps there is this knowledge that, hey, it's going badly, but like we said before, they don't have a plan B. So all they can do is keep on doubling down on their plan A and keep on supporting Ukraine. And with a hope and a prayer, there's at some point they believe that things will turn around. Of course, that's really not a strategy. Again, hope is not a strategy. That's what you do when you run out of options, is you just hope for some kind of miracle. That seems to be where a lot of them are. But anyway, going to the specifics of what's happening, the battles are continuing in those cities, and towns that, again, are quite, all of which are important. They're not insignificant points on the map, from Kupiansk all the way down to Gallipoli, and in the south, in Zaporizhzhia. These are all, they're hubs, they're fortified cities, and the Russians have already taken, the largest of them, which is Pokrovsk. Again, in the rear, increasingly into the rear, there is the holdouts in Mirnograd, but they can't even, that's just a mopping up operation, and the Russians are already pushing west from Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk is important. It was really the major hub in the rear for the Ukrainians for a long time. Once the Russians began to approach and encircle the city, it's obviously it lost its utility as a hub. You can't use a hub, that's semi-encircled. Now the Russians have it, and as they expand from it, it'll become their own hub, and it'll improve their logistics as they go forward, to complete the conquest of the remaining part of Donetsk. So that's a very important development. They have taken it; they're already moving west from it. And what you're going to see is that I think we could say that we're going to see half a dozen Avdiivkas, and happening more or less at the same time. Avdiivka was a very important battle. When the Russians took that, the line finally started to move. Again, it was in the spring of of last year, February 2024, when that happened. So actually, the winter, the end of the winter. But after that, before then, the line was hardly moving at all. We had the Battle of Bakhmut, which was very bloody, carried out, by the Wagner Company. But that went quite slowly and at great cost. There were, a lot of Russians actually died in that. It was Wagner, fought in a kind of in a rather, let's say, primitive way, or they weren't very careful with their men. Let's say that, and many of whom were convicts. But they won that battle. The Ukrainians, I believe, lost even more in that battle. But that was a very slow grinding battle. That was just one. And then after that, the line hardly moved at all. We had the great so-called great offensive of summer 2023. But when that one fortress town was finally broken through, they got through past the main line of fortification there, and we began to see what we call, not immediately, but it began to pick up speed, something of an operational bloom. And then that was further accelerated when they took Ugledar, which was another much smaller, but another true fortress town, very important. And that was taken, and it continued, so that we got those very rapid advances in the end of last year. So, but this time we're seeing it happen, up and down the line, all the way from Kupiansk to Golopolye. And so we're going to see something like, I think, Avdiivka squared or something, that it's going to happen, from after Golopolye falls, which is going to be soon. My understanding is that it's already under let's say fire control encirclement, and they're in the town and have a good portion of it. It's not that particularly big. It's already happened in Pokrovsk. Konstantinovka, they have it. It was reported like a week or two ago that they had 30% of the town. And meanwhile, though, they're tightening the encirclement. And with the fall of Pokrovsk, that makes it, and then, soon Mirnograd, because that's to the southwest of Konstantinovka, it'll be easy for the Russians to actually expand to the north and tighten that encirclement around Konstantinovka. Now, Konstantinovka is part of kind of that larger conurbation of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk. It's the southernmost part of that. It's a fairly decent-sized city in itself. It was 68,000, I believe, in 2022. Once that falls, then there's really nothing, or very little, to the north, as they head towards the final two cities where probably the final battle will be laid. Then we have Seversk. It's small, kind of like Uladar, but it's been very important. The Russians have actually been trying to take it, you could say, since 2022. I remember, like after the fall of Lysychansk, they say, next is going to be Seversk, but then it just stopped. And I guess there are a number of reasons to it. It's like Seversk itself is maybe not that hard. It was the surrounding areas that the Ukrainians really built up. There was a forest to the north of it that was so, let's say, crisscrossed with tunnels. The ground underneath it was like an ant colony. It was described that way. So it was just a very difficult barrier to break through, but they did a few months ago. And so that was really, I think, the turning point in that battle. And again, when that's gone, they can go directly towards, again, the big cities, the final cities of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, but go directly from the west. Kupiansk is basically taken, and now there's this kind of a cauldron over on the east side of the Olsko River, where there are a few thousand, apparently, Ukrainians hold up. They try to cross the river, but the Russians have fire control. They try to make temporary bridges, pontoon bridges, but they get destroyed immediately. So some of them clearly can escape, but it's whenever they attempt, they lose men, they lose equipment. They're in a terrible fix there. And then the last one, I guess I didn't mention, was Liman. Again, that was another important kind of a hub town. And, we have Kupiansk is pretty much like to the north of Slavyansk, and Liman to the northeast of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. So all these happen. You'll see an operational bloom. You'll see what we saw, following the fall of Avdiivka. But multiplied by 5 or something like that. It's just going to, that's what I predict. Again, we just never know. It may be the Russians choose to take a operational pause and consolidate. So it may not happen immediately, but I think we'll see it fairly soon. If, not right away, within a couple of months, we'll see a real acceleration as all these cities fall.
Okay, so yeah, a lot is happening along the front, but to be honest, I was expecting some more significant developments over the past week or two, and I'm kind of surprised that I'm not seeing more because we've talked about just the lack of manpower that Ukraine has, the lack of money, this fiscal cliff that is rapidly approaching in a couple of months. They may just be bankrupt, and just morale has to be rock bottom right now. Just the overwhelming firepower that Russia has, and the fact that right now the United States is signaling that it wants out of this. The number one backer of the Ukraine war is saying that we want to get out. So if you're a soldier on the front, some of this realism is trickling down. I mean, you're probably hungry for any information about what's going on in this war. What is the U.S. going to do? What is Europe going to do? You're paying attention. So they have to know. They have to know that the writing is on the wall. The military, the soldiers.
You would think so. I guess maybe we don't appreciate the intensity of the propaganda bubble that a lot of Ukrainians live within.
But so, you think that?
Yeah, but to some extent, it has to know. And I think we see it again. First of all, we are seeing that in the very high desertion rate. We are seeing that in the fact that they have to forcibly, violently conscript men on the streets. We see that. And I think right there we're getting visual evidence that there is awareness and, among the general population and an unwillingness, to fight. But they are grabbed. And what I've heard is, this was from the Ukrainian military that announced this recently, that they were decided to streamline the training process, which means that they don't even send them to some sort of camp, for a couple of weeks or a month or whatever it was, which is, woefully inadequate. Rather, they're going to send them directly to the front lines, to the units that need them. And they're going to do their training there. And I think that again shows desperation, but they're still just throwing bodies. It may also be an awareness of the high desertion rate and a way of trying to prevent desertions. Is that like we send them to the camp and half of them are gone in a week? They escape those camps. I think that's what happens. We'll just send them directly to the front and get them, and right to the front lines where they can't escape because we'll have our blocking units behind them, the ones that shoot them, if they try to turn and run. I don't know that that's what's going on, but I'm sure it is in some cases. All of that does indicate desperation. It indicates that they have their backs against the wall, that they are close to collapse, but they still have a certain number of bodies to throw into the battle. And we've seen that, I think, like up in the north, interestingly. It was pointed out by, I think, Scott of Calibrated, that he was kind of surprised that they have so few and so little in reserve, but most of it, instead of going down to Zaporozhye, where this big breakthrough is taking place, at Guliapole, but also south of the city of Zaporozhye. Recently, there was a very rapid expanse, and we can get into that a little bit later. That's the biggest breakdown, and it should be very alarming because after Guliapole falls, then we have Orekhina, I think it is, and that falls, and then there's really nothing between them and the city of Zaporozhye. A very significant city, where. But instead of sending the very few reserves that they had down there, apparently they sent them up north to Kupiansk to attend some counterattacks that had some limited success. And also, you could see it in farther north, in the city of Volchansk. That's another city that just recently fell. It's actually an important city. But it took a long time. The battle began, if I remember correctly, in May of last year. And it's just been very, very slow. The Ukrainians fought tooth and nail. but it was just building by building, meter by meter, and now the Russians have taken it. So there was something that they regarded as very high priority. Just the same thing we saw in Sumy. Remember, after the fall, the collapse of the Kursk pocket, the Russians continued to advance and crossed into Sumy, just south of Kursk, and that initially was rather rapid, but then I think the Ukrainians panicked and just sent a number of reserves, so that line has stabilized. Maybe the Russians are just satisfied with what they've done, but it's clear that the Ukrainians also placed a very high priority on that. And I think the reason is that Sumy is like the last major town on the road to Kiev. When you talk about Kupiansk and Volchansk, they are important towns on the road to Kharkov city. And that maybe is why that there may be even within the leadership an even greater concern about, these northern cities, Kiev for obvious reasons, and Kharkov than Zaporozhye. That's, just something to consider. But their reserves are very limited. Like down in Zaporozhye, apparently the Russians were approaching the city of Zaporozhye from two directions. One is, more or less from the east, and that would be through Guliopole. But the other one was directly from the south along the Dnieper, again, towards Zaporozhye city. And they're even closer in the south. But that line actually, there was advances a few months ago, and then pretty much it stopped or just slowed way down. There's a report, unconfirmed, that as Guliopole began to fall, the Ukrainians took an important drone unit and transferred it over to Guliopole from, the southern Zaporozhye. And so what happened is, Guliopole, the Russians are still advancing there, in a significant way, but it's slowed down a bit. But there in the south, the line pretty much collapsed or really began to crumble, and the Russians are making rapid advances. Another sign that they just don't have enough people. And interestingly, it seems like they're more concerned about what's happening farther north. That may or may not be true, but that was an observation again that Scott of Calibrated made, and it seems to be true.
Interesting. Well, we started this by you saying that the Ukrainians were living in their own propaganda bubble, but then you just talked a lot about the realism as well, the fact that there's these press gangs and there's just this desperation, the lack of men, having to move people up to the north. So they can't be living in that propaganda bubble that intensely, right? I mean, like you said, they can see with their own eyes. It's like, oh, what happened to Billy and Jimmy and Timmy? They all went off to the front and they never came back. They can put two and two together. Everybody knows, right? So, aren't you surprised that is it simply because, these poor men that are being forced conscripted, their choices is like, hey, we will get shot by these, the press gangs or the Ukrainian military, or we go to the front and we'll probably get killed there, but maybe there's a chance that we survive. Is that the only thing that's kind of keeping this Ukrainian military machine going? Is just that fear, like we have the guns now, you get up there and fight or we will kill you? I mean, what is there any... Is that the only motivating force here?
Well, that's obviously important, a very important part of it. But then there's also, you have to look at the enforcers, the actual press gangs. They obviously clearly believe in what they're doing. Well, maybe not. With the press gangs, apparently they make money off of what they do. So, who knows? It may be just pure corruption to a great extent with them. But the leadership, is not, again, they have a chance to negotiate with the Russians. If they really understand how bad things are, they should, right? If they fully appreciate it, but they aren't. So I would say, and then there are, their numbers are much smaller than they used to be, but there are the true believers and, the Banderites among the soldiers, and there still is the Azov, brigades. It's now the 3rd Assault Brigade, and another one whose name now escapes me, but there are other, far right or, ultra-nationalist brigades. And those are still true believers. Though it must be pointed out that many of them, more than Zelensky and his regime, more than the Western nationalists, the liberal nationalists that support the regime, they are actually asking for a ceasefire. more so than the government is. Again, not a settlement. They want, they can't give up on the idea of reconquering their lands and defeating Russia, but they understand it's a bad situation. I guess, what the part maybe where the propaganda bubble exists and is still having an effect is this belief that the West is going to come and save them, that they made a kind of a civilizational decision back in 2014. It wasn't the general population, because it wasn't done through a popular vote, but through this coup that took place to go with the West. And they made it again in 2022 when they listened to Boris Johnson and rejected the Russian offer. They're going to stick with the West. And they're just, they have thrown in their lot with the West. They have, and I don't think it's something they can retreat from. And they still seem to believe that somehow, one way or another, that the West is going to come to their rescue. And they just need to stick it out. That it's a little bit like those poor soldiers in Mirnograd who've been told that, we're going to come and rescue. And apparently they seem to still believe it, but it's not going to happen. It's the same thing, writ large for the whole Ukrainian ruling regime.
Yeah, I understand that feeling and that sentiment, just that, and I think many people would have made that bet years ago. But as time goes on, that's just ebbing. And then why I was saying now, why I was expecting more to be happening on the front right now is because the U.S. is clearly signaling that, no, we are not going to come and save you. And when you say that the West is going to save you, really we're talking about the United States. And the U.S. is just showing that, well, first, that it just simply can't. It just doesn't have the equipment to stop the Russians. It just can't do it. And Trump, and then we had this huge national security strategy paper where it was just saying that we're out, and you can see Trump is sending Witkoff over there, that it's done. So that signal is clear now. So I think any belief that you think that the U.S. is going to come and save you, it's got to be running close to empty, right? There can't be a lot of faith left. So that's why I was expecting what would cause some type of frontline collapse. It's just this complete morale collapse. It's like, our hope is gone. Where is our hope? America's not coming to save us. We're out of money. They're all corrupt. We're out of men. It's just, we're out of weapons. What are we doing here? It's over. You think that would just, and you think that type of thinking is also something that could spread like a virus throughout a military. Once that sets in, then all of a sudden it's just like, it's over. No, the will to fight is gone. But it hasn't happened. And I guess that's why I'm surprised. And I'm just waiting for that moment. And then,
right. Well, I guess I would put it down to part of it is the ideological zealotry of the band rights and their control of the military. I think that is a big part of it. They understand that it's a bad situation, but they do not want to give up. They would like to have a temporary pause, but it's only to continue the fight another day. They do not want to ever surrender. For them, it's just, it's a fate worse than death. I think that's really how they think. These are, again, they are ideological extremists, on par with ISIS. And in many ways, they really are. And that explains part of it, is that you have these fanatics, again, in positions of power, in the military power, and they have them sprinkled throughout the different military units. And you have the so-called blocking units, that are trying to enforce this discipline on people that clearly are unwilling. Now, in the greater part of the Ukrainian population, this has a very different view of things. And, we mentioned the high desertion rates. There was another statistic that really struck me recently. I think it was back in the spring that actually the Ukrainians decided to do something like the Russians have been doing, and offer voluntary enlistment, but on good terms, with good pay and, really attractive terms. And over the course, I can't remember the exact number, but over the course of a couple of months, they got like 500 men a month. That's what we're talking about. And so there are very few people that signed up for that. And that tells you a lot, doesn't it? They were looking particularly at the 18 through 24s who are not being forcibly conscripted right now. But in the fall, we had this strange move, which a lot of people, I think, in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine don't really understand. It's not clear why he did it. Zelensky decided to lift the ban on travel outside of Ukraine for younger men. I guess maybe it was 18 to 23, something like that. And immediately a lot of them left. Within 2 months, it was 100,000. Over 100,000, and just contrast that. You had the attractive, benefits. The good for voluntary conscription. So few of them, just a few hundred, signed up for that. But then, well over 100,000 just ran when they had a chance to run. So the average Ukrainian does know what's going on. And again, you just look at that and you say, this is not going to last. It's true. It's amazing that I agree with you. I'm kind of surprised. I think we all are, that it's lasted as long as it does, as it has. I think a big part of it, though, maybe with exception, like in the first years, 2022, 2023, there was some kind of general patriotism within the Ukrainian populations. The Russians invaded, I'm going to fight back. And, a lot of the average Ukrainian men, not all of them by a long shot, but a lot of them actually did willingly sign up. But that's gone. So many of those people have been killed, and then things have changed, and they started to realize, this is not what we were told it was. So can they just keep on doing this? I don't think so. You just look at the math, it's just not adding up. And then you mentioned the huge reduction in U.S. support, and at least for the time being, I think over the last couple of quarters, the Europeans have managed to fill the gap, but we're seeing that the Europeans just can't keep that up, and that's why they're trying to steal this money, because they can't do it. So, yeah, just in the end, just whether you're talking about money, you're talking about men, you're talking about, military equipment, weapons, it doesn't add up. And there just has to be a collapse, And I guess I am surprised, too, that it hasn't happened already. But it's going to happen.
Right. I'm just looking for, straws of hope grasping for them here for the Ukrainians. And I just don't see any to grab, what is it that you can really hope for? It's
right.
A complete reversal from Trump, I guess, which is possible. You never know. That's the only thing.
But the thing is, like, even with you say, okay, maybe there's a military coup in the U.S. and Joe Biden too takes over, and I think the Ukrainians would have more equipment, but there's just a limit to what the U.S. can do. That's part of what's happening. It's just actually Trump and his people just see the reality. It's just like, the Pentagon is telling them behind the scenes, we already gave them all of those and all of these, and none of those things worked. All that we have left are the Tomahawks, and for these reasons, he probably shouldn't try that. And, they realize too. It's just, it's not just a matter of, policy choices. There's real physical constraints here that they're coming up against. And then, even if they do get the weapons, if you don't have the manpower, it doesn't really matter.
Do you think Kiev will become a Russian city in the near future?
I don't know. Who knows? Kiev.
Historically, do the Russian people, do they view Kiev as a Russian city historically? Because, Kharkov and Odessa, I understand they view these
it's almost
as
entirely
cities.
Russian speaking. And I think Kiev is actually, I don't know if it's majority Russian speaking, but I think it may be. That there's an effort to change that, but the Ukrainians are finding it difficult. In fact, the leadership, what I hear is like when they have meetings, non-public meetings, they all speak in Russian. I think that's actually still the mother tongue of most people in Kiev. It doesn't mean if you're Russian speaking that you identify as an ethnic Russian. Ukraine's a complicated place. There's this big question: is there a chance? A lot of Ukrainians, there are these Banderites who again, have always been there even through the Soviet years. We can go into that in more detail right now. I'm reading a very interesting history on that. They've always been there, and they have, since really taken power and come into their own, taken control of the military and have a great deal of influence within the government, so that their thinking has become pretty much just sort of a modified version of it, of banderism, slightly prettied up for Western consumption so that we don't openly talk about our, Jew hatred or something, or we set that aside because it's not so important. It has become really the ruling ideology in so many ways. Again, I think that explains why they're still fighting, why they won't make the hard decisions that they need to make. But can that be reversed? That's kind of a hard question to answer. Could we have some sort of real meaningful counter coup within Ukraine? When people say this was a huge mistake, banderism has destroyed this country. Let's throw these bums out. And, at this point, you don't see any sign of it. Well, you see only indirectly in the fact that, like, for example, when the press gangs grab somebody on the street, a crowd will immediately form and try to rescue the guy. Or that happens again and again. It shows that there's a lot of anger at the regime among common people. Now, you can have a lot of anger and a regime can still, against a regime, and that regime can go on and on and on. You have to have organized opposition. And a powerful opposition, something that has to extend into the corridors of power. It has to have arms. And right now, that's not happened. But maybe we could have some military coup, not carried out by the banderites. Unfortunately, again, within the military, it's like the leaders, the ones that are most likely to lead a coup at the present time, if it should happen, are banderites themselves. So you just don't see it. But maybe somewhere down the road, there will be some change. That's all I can say.
Well,
so anyway, we're talking about Kiev. That is a very large city. We're talking about a city of like over 3 million, I believe. It would be very hard to take. A good part of it is on the western side of the Dnieper, on the right bank, and I don't know if the Russians want to do. They may decide to do it. They may find as things develop that they sense that there's a shift occurring within Ukraine. The Ukrainians have become so weak, that what would be almost an impossible task, maybe not impossible, but it would require general mobilization within Russia. It has become, a much more feasible task. So it could happen somewhere down the road. I don't think it's anywhere on the current agenda. I think they're probably much more focused, especially in light of these recent attacks on the tankers on southern Ukraine, which again, historically has been a part of Russia. So, I'm speaking, mainly of Odessa and Nikolaev,
right.
That's something that would be strategically more important. But they may find, who knows, maybe they'll do that first and then find that Ukraine is really weakened not just militarily, but maybe ideologically. I don't know if that's going to happen. Maybe that those extremists will only become all the more extreme as the end draws near. It's hard to say.
Right. I mean, you're saying how, up in Sumy, there's a clear shot to Kiev from there. And then if we talk about a proper collapse that we think is coming, when that happens, what does the regime do? It has to force conscript as many people as it can, what it can do, like what
try
to
right. At some
people.
point, they're going to go out and look for guys, and there's not going to be anything.
Or everybody will start turning on the regime. Just say, well, now we want the Russians here because it's over, and you refuse to admit that it's over and settle some deal, and you're just killing what few men remain. Maybe you're going to start sending women to the front. Who knows? At that point, then it's just like you have become the bad guys and you become illegitimate, and then there will be a welcome change, and then people will want the Russians to come in to save them from this oppressive regime, essentially. Maybe that's what will happen. I don't know.
That's worth considering. I mean, it just seems like.
But in
a way, I'm surprised it hasn't happened already. I mean, again, these people just have a real firm grip. They have a firm grip on military power, and then also on the on the information space to the extent that it's possible. In these days, it's not very hard for anyone, including in Ukraine, to go find a Telegram channel or whatever. I think maybe part of it is many of them been so brainwashed that they don't look at the Russian channels. I'm sure some of them do, but a lot of them have been told, they just lie. And they kind of think, I have the sense about a lot of Ukrainians, they see their own governments corrupt and lies all the time. They assume the Russians is just a mirror image of that. And so they don't even believe it. It's sort of like they don't understand that things have changed since the 1990s. Ukraine never got out of that, but Russia really did to a great extent. And they don't see it. So anyway, there's control over the military and over the information space, because you have this really, I would say, a diabolical alliance between the Banderites and the Western nationalists. And the Western nationalists really control the information space, and they're very tightly allied with the Europeans, and they get sort of derive their authority from the Europeans. So, they say, this is the truth. This is what the Europeans say. And there are a lot of people who just still have this abiding faith in Europe, which I think is very much misplaced, but it's there.
Right. But I mean, at the end of the day, this war won't end until there is a regime change in Kiev. We can't have this Zelensky. I mean, first of all, Putin has said as well that this is an illegitimate leader. He didn't have elections. So an agreement that they have with him we can't recognize that. Right. So there's going to be a regime change, whether it's organic or if Russia forces it. That's what's going to happen. Right. And that means doing something in Kiev, right?
It's a good point. And it may be that the Russians will see the logic of that. They'll just decide, this is something we have to do to make this permanent. That's the problem. Because if we go so far and then stop, it's not over. They're just going to look for another day. And that regime is going to be there. They're going to be just devoted to our destruction, and they're going to have the support of the Europeans and probably the Americans with a future administration or something. They may go for Kiev. I think there is a real logic there. It's not West Ukraine. There's a real difference. When you get Eastern and Southern Ukraine, you get a large percentage of people that identify as Russians. Not just Russian speakers, but ethnic Russians. But then in Western Ukraine, that's the real, home of Banderism. And you do get these ideological zealots that, that's where they are, that's their home, and you go into that territory, you're going to be faced with a populace that actually just hates you, that has been trained to hate you, that, they've made that part of their identity. It's an anti-Russian identity that they have. That's not true for, I think, central Ukraine, which is Kiev is a part of. It's not ethnically Russian, but there are ethnic Russians there. But it has always been long been sort of an in-between area. And that in-between area could maybe switch, maybe if the Russians still finally come and then, the populace that supported the previous regime said, well, they lost. Here's the new, the new regime, and let's see how it works. And if like Mariupol and whatever, or anything to any indication of what could happen, it's actually worked out very well. I mean, these are you don't hear anything about Mariupol, for example. There was a very destructive battle there, of course, in 2022. The Russians took it from the Ukrainians. A lot of the city was destroyed, but it's being rebuilt, and life is increasingly is good there and better than it ever has been under the Ukrainian government.
Mm. Do you think that there's any chance that we're not seeing more rapid movement currently on the front is because there is some semblance of a negotiation, of a peace settlement, that maybe Russia is trying to give Trump a little bit of space, and that's why there's not an operational bloom? Or do you think that that's not in their calculation at all? It's like, let's just move forward, because the faster they move, then the more leverage they have, right? That's like,
I don't think so. I think it's just that the Russians are being very cautious and trying to conserve their own lives. This, again, is still, because this is a drone war above all, when you come to the front lines. And even though there's been this tremendous loss of manpower, the Ukrainians still have drones, and they still can kill you if you try to mass and attempt, a big mass your forces and attempt a big aero offensive. And so they still proceed very cautiously. At some point, I don't know where that tipping point is. I think that'll change. I think they're just being careful. Another thing that's going on is that there's this that we haven't even discussed. There's this war in the air, which is a completely one-sided war. It's just that Russia pummels Ukraine every night and sometimes during the day as well. They've been just one huge strike after another, and they have taken their power grid, just really have wiped out most of it. We've talked about, why it took so long. It was actually built with overcapacity by the Soviets, and then there was this loss of population or whatever. So it was like 150% or 160%, but they've taken it down to like 20%. The Ukrainians are forced to import electricity now from Europe, whereas before they used to export electricity to EU. But that still isn't enough. There are regularly scheduled blackouts all throughout the country. And I guess it's particularly bad in the eastern part of the country because the Russians haven't just taken out power plants and substations, but transmission lines. So they've taken it right to the edge. It's already it's crippled. It's on life support. And I think at any time, if they decide, they can just take it out completely. And they might do that before a big aero offensive just to just completely freeze Ukrainian logistics. But that's going on, and then attacks on the rail system, on train stations, and on air bases and other military infrastructure. That's just happening all the time, and it is wearing down. So where they're not just being worn down at the front lines, they're being worn down in the rear too. And the thing is, the reason I bring it up right now is that, if anything, that has accelerated since the so-called negotiations have begun. So it's kind of interesting. Before there was this hue and cry about it. It's like the Russians it's not fair. They're actually attacking from the air, and obviously they're not interested in peace. The Russians just ignored that and went ahead and continued to accelerate. And now we don't even hear much talk about it. Clearly the Russians are committed to this, regardless of what's happening in the diplomatic space, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, I saw a video on X of a steam train being used in Ukraine because apparently some of these trains, they're all require electricity to run, and I guess it was being too intermittent and they couldn't run, so they pulled out a steam engine. So this is just an example of if you don't know the writing's on the wall, when you look at your country resorting to steam trains, you're like, I think we're in trouble. Yeah, it's over, right?
Yeah, no, I've heard that from different sources, and it may very well be true.
Yeah, I did see X.
I saw a community note on X that said this was like a Christmas train, a tourist thing, and so it might not be true, but it could be. The fact is that the train service has been severely impacted. Mm-hmm. But let's be not so sure about that one story, but it's just true. They're in a terrible fix, so it's not just that you don't have power, often it could be 16 hours a day. But also, just traveling from city to city is becoming increasingly difficult because, trains, you can't rely on trains to run anymore. They rely on the electrical grid just like everyone else does.
Right. So things are just looking so bleak. And let's talk a bit about Ukraine's only hope, its backers. Thomas Massie just put a bill to the floor to have the U.S. Leave NATO. Do you think this is a real possibility that that NATO will end, that the United States could actually leave? I think General Flynn has also expressed similar sentiments that, what's the point of NATO? This is a Cold War relic, and it's just costing us tons of money and doing nothing for us except causing problems.
Exactly. Right. Again, it's. I hope it succeeds. I doubt that it will, but it's you have to start somewhere. There's still, my understanding, a very strong bipartisan consensus to support NATO. It's just like this status quoism is very powerful. We always had NATO. How can we give up on NATO? And I think it's going to be here for a while, but I hope one day, and maybe potentially a real severe defeat here in the Ukraine war will lead to some real soul searching in the West, and I think just a really hard-headed analysis of NATO and the need for it, or maybe the absence of that need. That's I hope that we're there. We're not there yet, but it's good to see. It's just like you see it on Trump on good days, right? He's anti-NATO. He clearly doesn't like it. That's good. And then there are individuals like Thomas Massie and General Flynn. But in general, it's just like we still have the old establishment, and they just can't imagine NATO going away. It's going to be here for a while.
Okay, well, the U.S. is still sending strong signals that it's not interested in funding this Ukraine war, and it is pulling out. And then I want to just talk about continental Europe as well, because I want to just take an excerpt from the National Security Strategy paper that we discussed on Monday. There's a direct quote from it. Continental Europe has been losing share of global GDP, down from 25% in 1990 to 14% today. But this economic decline is eclipsed by the real and more stark prospect of civilizational erasure. Should present trends continue, the continent will be unrecognizable in 20 years or less. Now, civilizational erasure, that sounds a bit melodramatic, but, before this paper made the rounds online, we actually had a talk just a couple days before, and I asked you, is Western civilization dying? And you said, yeah, it's pretty much dead. More or less. And then this paper comes out and talks about civilizational erasure. I mean, that sounds a bit much, right? Countries come and go, but civilizations, aren't those supposed to be a bit more permanent? When's the last time we've had a civilizational erasure? Is this just is it too much what we're saying? You know what I mean? Is that and I'm tying this into Ukraine war as well, just talking about just Ukraine. You said that it tied its boat to Western civilization. It was backing it. And now the U.S. comes out with the paper and says this civilization is not going to exist much longer. And you're like, oh, damn, this is what I put all of my chips into this civilization, and now you're telling me it's not going to exist soon?
Right. Yeah. Well, I stand by my words. I think that that assessment is largely accurate. 20 years might be too short a time frame. I think in part they're talking about demographic collapse, the very low birth rates within Europe, and then high rates of immigration from non-European, countries. And I think, and maybe even more important, the failure to assimilate those people. So, you can have immigration, but if it's assimilate, like in the U.S., for example, in the early 20th century, there were some worries, of course, about the failure to assimilate people from Ireland and Eastern Europe and so on and so forth. And that led to more restrictive immigration policies. But those people, all became Americans, and that's what they put first. They weren't just hyphenated Americans. They had pride in having an Italian background, but, they were all they understood that, they were proud Americans, and that was their new identity. They adopted a new identity. There is a real problem when you don't assimilate people, either because they come from a background that's just too different, or I think in the case of Europe, it's just because the European identity has been so diluted. And we talked about that. It's like with the growth of the EU, with its increasing power, it starts to dissolve and weaken the identities of the sovereign nations of Europe. These nations become increasingly less sovereign. Identities weaken. Nobody thinks I'm a proud, subject of the EU bureaucracy. And goes, the only people that I think wave EU flags are NGO employees in Tbilisi, those kind of people. But in general, that's not something, you're not going to die for the EU flag. And so you have this weak identity. You have a lot of people coming from countries with very, very different backgrounds. And I don't want to, that leads to sometimes ugly xenophobia, I know. I don't share that. I have respect for these different Muslim countries, for example, but they are very different, and that has to be understood. And then, you bring in a lot of people from a different country, and you can't expect that will be assimilated, especially when you're fighting to maintain your own identity. So then you have these conflicts and the chance of real erasure, as the paper says. It is a serious problem. It's not. There is an economic stagnation. Still Western Europeans are wealthy people by world standard, but that the edge that they had is ebbing away. And there is a chance, if they continue on this current course, where they keep on making decisions that are really not in their own interests, but are being made for ideological or emotional reasons, especially anti-Russian. They have done themselves a great deal of damage in the economic war that they've attempted to wage against Russia. It's just that at some point, it's obviously not true. They still have, I think they're really resting on their laurels on past achievements, but they still are able to convince a lot of people in poorer countries to the east, like in Ukraine, to look to them as a model. But that, as time goes by, that's maybe their soft power part of it. That is obviously in decline, and it will continue to be in decline. And everything has a tipping point. At some point, there's just people. Why are we looking at? Other countries will turn away in disgust.
Have we had? What's the last civilizational erasure we have? I mean, it's weird for me to even think about a civilization being erased. Like, that just doesn't happen. Right?
Well, you have to say that, the Roman Empire, that was a civilization.
But it's still part of Western civilization, right? Or just a phase of it. It's not like that's one. An empire dying is one thing, but that's not a civilization. Countries and empires come and goes. I feel like a civilization is just such a more permanent thing. You're trying to erase not just the country lines, but the identity, the makeup. The Roman Empire didn't do that so much, right?
I think to some extent it did. Obviously parts of Rome persisted in the languages and cultures of different people, especially in the Mediterranean countries, but nobody says I'm a Roman citizen anymore. I haven't said that for many centuries.
That's not civilization, though, right? It's not the country.
But there's part of it. It is. Maybe. Of course, there are the great civilizations of the Middle East, of the Tigris and Euphrates, valley. That the earliest civilizations. Clearly they're gone, but we're talking about thousands and thousands of years ago, and the languages they spoke to have ceased to exist. So there's just really nothing left. Of course, the Qing dynasty fell, and so that was a certain kind of civilization that came to an end. But
still
China
Chinese,
right? And they are drawing very much on that. They did actually. You can say that the Cultural Revolution was an attempt to erase Chinese civilization and to create something completely new. And it failed. The Chinese have a very strong sense of their connection with those past dynasties, and they brought that back, and they've some of the philosophies that were part of the that really informed and shaped Chinese political practice over the course of many dynasties. It's come back. There's Confucianism and the thinking of Mengzi, Mencius. That's these ancient ways of thought and ancient practices. It's not like it's just a continuation. And there's this, obviously China is a modern country that has adapted that, that traditional way of thinking and has rejected certain elements there. But they are going back and they're finding, hey, this is part of who we are. And, we are Chinese, and our roots go back through these dynasties into the distant past. The civilization, in a way, part of it collapsed, but it doesn't. it's rare. You have to almost entirely replace the people for the civilization to collapse utterly. And there's two ways, through a genocide, or, I guess the possibility is just if your own people stop reproducing and they're just replaced by another people. And maybe that's what the paper is suggesting, that could happen.
Yeah, it's just, seeing that line, civilizational erasure, I think it might have just woken some people up. I mean, not just so much that paper, but just this idea is becoming more prominent in people. And I think it just came out of left field for a lot of people. I never would have thought of Europe in a civilizational erasure. I know there are people that have talked about this problem, but there wasn't a military conquest, there wasn't a major revolution, and then all of a sudden it's like you wake up like, oh, your civilization is about dead now. And a lot of people, I think, were like, wait, what? I just thought Europe will always be Europe. And it's just, isn't it kind of surprising?
I get the sense, though, that the problem is that a lot of people may know it or be somewhat aware of what they're facing in Europe, but they don't care. That's part of the problem. That's that weakening of identity. That's this apathy. It's like, I'm here for 70 years, 80 years, whatever it is on this, and I'll try to enjoy things, avoid pain, maximize my pleasure. And then I don't care. Maybe I'll reproduce. Maybe I won't. I was born in France and I have this, that's what my passport says. That's pretty useful, but I don't care. What is it? Those people that came before me, they're dead. One day I'll be dead. It doesn't matter. I mean, I think, unfortunately, that's the way a lot of Europeans look at things. And that's why you get, when you ask them, are you willing to defend your country? If it is invaded, you get very, very few responding in the affirmative. That's no, that would be too bad, but I'm not going to risk my own life for that.
So do you see then just a new civilization slowly forming that is just sort of a blend of old Europe with these characteristics from a lot of these Arab and Muslim countries for these immigrants, and that's what it'll be? It'll be it'll be something just kind of new?
Well, I mean, I don't know. Again, there could be a new Muslim conquest, like which would happen in Iberia in the early centuries of, following the fall of the Roman Empire. That was
the
reversed.
Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah, well, that was the reconquest.
The
Reconquista. But there was a Muslim conquest, and it was under. So that could happen. That parts of Europe could become Muslim. That maybe is what we're looking at. There's nothing certain about that, but it could happen. There may be certain parts of Europe that take a different path, like, we see at least an attempt being made by the Hungarians, for example, and others, especially in Eastern Europe. And they may, they may be able to fashion a new Europe, who knows, perhaps in alliance with Russia. But I just don't know. I mean, it's just these kind of things are so hard to forecast. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think there's clear that the Europe that exists now is coming to an end. It doesn't, it can't. It's a Europe run by bureaucrats. It's a Europe, that just doesn't have the will to survive. Again, it's those polls that tell you that. Are you going to fight for your own country? If you don't have that, it's just like in the end, I don't think you can. It's a very competitive world. Sometimes it's not necessarily military competition, but it can be that. And if you don't have that desire, that willingness to actually to sacrifice for your own people, it has to be part of something, I think, of a country that really will survive in the long run. Whether it's by enlisting as a soldier or it's just like as a politician, actually being more concerned really with the future of your country than with your own career. And I think, unfortunately, in Europe, you don't even have that kind of politician. They're part of this globalist community, and they don't seem to give a damn about their own peoples and, like the real future of Germany or France or the UK, not part of the EU, but certainly part of Europe.
It's just interesting to think about. Like, if we look in the future, when we look back in history books, will it be like Western civilization, 2000 BC to to 2025 or what, you know, I mean, like when we look back and like, that was the end. What made it the end?
Yeah.
It was World War II. And then after that, just this apathy, the bureaucratization of Europe with the EU, it's such a strange phenomena. This nihilism that kind of gripped the whole continent, this, you know, not wanting to have children. It's just,
yeah. You know, it has to be pointed out that, you know, that other countries are struggling with the same thing. You know, Russia,
Japan.
China, you know, they have very low fertility rates. So, you know, they're all facing these challenges, but they seem to have at least, you know, they're not losing their identity. That's one thing. So there's maybe I don't know how things will turn out. You know, again, I don't have a crystal ball, but it seems like they do have a very important edge over the Europeans.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I don't know what to say. I guess we just have to see.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else you want to talk about, Dad, or shall we end it there?
I don't know. This seems like an appropriate place to end it.
Well,
yeah.
All right.
Or maybe to put a bookmark in it. We don't want to end it right yet.
Yeah. Okay. All right, Dad. All right. Thanks a bunch. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll talk to you soon.
All right. We'll see you. Bye-bye.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.